Throughout history, U.S. presidents have often left lasting legacies, some for their policies, others for their leadership during pivotal moments. But some presidents have another remarkable distinction. They lived longer than most of their successors and predecessors. In today's video, we are counting down the 5 longest-lived U.S. presidents. John Adams was born on October 30th, 1735 in Braintree, Massachusetts, today known as Quincy. His father, John Adams Sr., was a farmer and cobbler. His mother was Susanna Boylston. John Adams graduated from Harvard in 1758 and became a lawyer. He married his third cousin, Abigail Smith, in 1764 and had 6 children with her. One of them, John Quincy Adams, would later become the 6th President of the United States. By the 1760s, Adams was already a leading proponent of colonial rights. He especially fought against the 1765 Stamp Act and the 1767 Townshend Acts and was a true believer of the no taxation without representation idea. After the Boston Massacre in 1770, Adams took the controversial role of representing the British troops in their murder trial. In the end, 6 of 8 British soldiers were acquitted. In 1774 and 1775, Adams was elected by Massachusetts to the First and Second Continental Congress. There he nominated no other than George Washington to command the Continental Army. By the late 1770s, Adams became a leading figure in the fight for independence against Britain and the establishment of the United States. During the War of Independence, John Adams took the role as head of the Board of War and also began to travel to Europe as the official envoy. It was also Adams who fought for recognition of the newly established state overseas. In 1785, John Adams was named as the first ambassador to Great Britain. In 1789, John Adams became the first Vice President of the United States under the presidency of George Washington. He, however, was rarely consulted by Washington and as such claimed that his role was the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. Adams would be the first president to run in a contested election. This occurred in 1796 and resulted in a narrow win for Adams against his political rival Thomas Jefferson. When John Adams took up his role as president in 1797, he was confronted with the warfare over in France caused by the French Revolution. He held the United States out of the warfare and increased the size of the Navy. In the 1800 election, John Adams was defeated by his vice president Thomas Jefferson. Depressed over the loss, John Adams left office in 1801. In 1812, Adams and Jefferson cleared their problems and became good friends. Coincidentally, both men died on the exact same day, July 4th, 1826. The 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in which both men took part in. Ronald Reagan was born on February 6, 1911, in Tampico, Illinois. He was the son of John Edward Reagan, a salesman, and Nell Clyde Wilson. Reagan attended Eureka College in Illinois, where he was a member of the football team, captain of the swim team, and student body president. He graduated in 1932 and worked as a sportscaster on radio stations. In 1937, the 26-year-old Reagan was given a 7-year contract with Warner Brothers and from then on appeared in many movies. Perhaps the most memorable of them all is Canute Rockne, All-American, which aired in 1940. After another movie, King's Row, Ronald Reagan was considered a Hollywood star, but the Second World War intervened in his career. As a U.S. Army reservist, he was ordered to active duty. Due to his bad eyesight, he however never actively fought on the front. Reagan was instead assigned to the 1st Motion Picture Unit in California, which produced training films. Reagan took up his acting and TV career after the war, starring in another 24 films. In 1948, he married Nancy Davis, with whom he would have 2 children. Before that, Ronald Reagan was married to actress Jane Wyman for 7 years, with whom he also had 3 children, one of them being adopted. Reagan's political career began in the 1960s when he was elected governor of California. Originally, Ronald Reagan had been a Democrat, but switched sides after Dwight Eisenhower became president. In 1976, Ronald Reagan had an unsuccessful attempt for the Republican presidential nomination. However, it would not take long until it would be his turn. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won the Republican presidential nomination. With George H.W. Bush as his vice presidential running mate, they won the 1980 election against incumbent President Jimmy Carter. During his presidency, Ronald Reagan mainly concentrated on the economy, which he nicknamed Reaganomics. His policies showed effects. During his presidency, the GDP went from a 0.3% decline to a 4.1% growth, and the unemployment rate declined by 1.6%. Reagan was a hardliner whose strategy, especially in regards of the Cold War, differed from his predecessors. While presidents before him pursued a policy of parity with the Soviet Union and only preventing a nuclear war through the perpetual threat of nuclear war, Reagan pursued an end to the Cold War. His policy was peace through strength, which meant that he expanded the armed forces. In addition, he formulated the Reagan Doctrine, under which the US supported anti-communist and anti-Soviet movements. Ronald Reagan also became the target of an assassination attempt in 1981. He was seriously wounded by a revolver bullet and was close to death when he arrived at the emergency room. His condition was stabilized and Reagan was able to leave the hospital 12 days later. Ronald Reagan was easily re-elected during the 1984 presidential election. On one side, Reagan's second term was marked by his biggest foreign policy embarrassment, also known as the Iran-Contra scandal. On the other side, it was Reagan who made a significant contribution to the end of the Cold War. In his 1987 speech in Berlin, Reagan challenged Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Within a year of leaving office, the Berlin Wall was torn down. Reagan spent his post-presidency with his wife in their homes in Bel Air and Santa Barbara County. In 1994, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. In his last statement, Reagan said, "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America there will always be bright dawn ahead." Ronald Reagan died on June 5, 2004. Gerald Ford was born on July 14, 1913 as Leslie Lynch King Jr. in Omaha, Nebraska. His father was Leslie Lynch King Sr., and his mother was Martha Alicia Porter King. His parents divorced immediately after his birth. In 1916, his mother remarried to a man named Gerald Ford. The family from then on lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Although officially named Leslie, the young boy went by the same name as his stepfather. He officially changed his name to Gerald Rudolph Ford in 1935. Gerald Ford attended the University of Michigan, where he was a star football player. He in fact even turned down some offers in order to study law at Yale. He graduated from Yale in 1941 and entered the US Navy. After serving in the Second World War, Ford married Elizabeth Bloomer. The couple would go on to have 4 children. In 1948, Gerald Ford was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and would be re-elected 12 times. In 1965, Ford was named House Minority Leader. In 1973, after the resignation of Vice President Spiro Agnew, Gerald Ford was approved by Congress as Vice President. He was sworn in on December 6th of that year. Only 9 months later, President Richard Nixon resigned following the Watergate scandal, making Gerald Ford the only U.S. president never elected to that office, nor the office of vice president. A month into his presidency, Gerald Ford officially pardoned Richard Nixon. As U.S. President, Gerald Ford was confronted with a weak economy and the ongoing Vietnam War. Ford survived 2 assassination attempts within 17 days in September of 1975. In 1976, Gerald Ford won the Republican presidential nomination but narrowly lost the election to Democrat Jimmy Carter. Although his views on politics differed, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter became good friends. Ford retired to Southern California but remained in the public eye. Gerald Ford remained in good health until late in life. He died on December 26, 2006. George H.W. Bush was born on June 12, 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts. His father was Prescott Bush, a wealthy businessman. His mother was Dorothy Walker. Bush attended the Phillips Academy where he graduated in 1942. After graduating, George Bush entered into the U.S. Navy as an aviator. He served in World War II as a torpedo bomber pilot. His plane was shot down once, but he managed to get rescued by a submarine. He returned to the U.S. in 1945 and married Barbara Pierce. The two would go on to have 6 children together, one of them being the later President George W. Bush. After his duty in the Navy, George Bush attended Yale University, where he became the team captain of the baseball team. He graduated from Yale in 1948 and moved his family to Texas to start a career in the oil business. Bush's political career began in the 1960s with a failed bid for the U.S. Senate. However, in 1966 he would be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and was re-elected in 1968. In 1970, George Bush once again failed to be elected for the U.S. Senate. Instead, he was made U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations in 1971. In 1973, Bush was asked by Richard Nixon to take over as chairman of the Republican Party. He was the one who advised Nixon to resign. In 1974, President Gerald Ford named George Bush head of the liaison office to the People's Republic of China. Only 2 years later, Ford called Bush back in order to take over the post of director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He held that post for a year until he returned to the private sector. In 1980, George Bush lost the Republican presidential nomination to Ronald Reagan. He was instead made Reagan's running mate. After his re-election as vice president in 1984, Bush already began the preparations for his own presidential nomination. George Bush won the 1988 presidential election, although his famous sentence, "Read my lips, no new taxes," almost cost him his credibility. Bush's first crisis as a president came in 1989 with the U.S. invasion of Panama. George Bush followed in Ronald Reagan's footsteps regarding the Cold War. In 1991, Bush met with Mikhail Gorbachev to sign the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. The biggest event in his presidency, however, would be the Gulf War, which broke out in 1990. The Gulf War ended in a victory for the US and its allies, which sparked Bush's approval rates. It was therefore assumed that he would win the 1992 presidential election. However, it would be Bush's unkept promise, read my lips, no new taxes, and a much younger, fresher face who would keep him from winning the re-election. After his presidency, George Bush and his wife spent their time between Texas and Maine. Two of their sons would enter politics like their father. On his 90th birthday, the former president took a parachute jump like he did when he managed to escape his damaged bomber during the Second World War. George H.W. Bush died on November 30th, 2018. James Earl Carter, better known as Jimmy, was born on October 1st, 1924 in Plains, Georgia. His father was James Earl Carter Sr. and his mother was Bessie Lillian Gordy. Initially starting his education at the Georgia Southwestern College, he later changed to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. He graduated in 1946 and married Rosalind Smith that same year. Jimmy Carter was assigned to the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarine program but never actually commanded one. Upon the death of his father, Carter resigned in 1953 and returned to his hometown Plains. There he took over the family business called the Golden Peanut Company. The business was in debts, and as a result, Jimmy Carter and his family lived in federally subsidized housing. Jimmy Carter's political career began in 1962 when he won a seat in the state legislature. He was re-elected to this position in 1964. Carter was an early supporter of the civil rights movement. However, this was unpopular among other Southern Democrats. As such, he turned his focus on his political career and ran unsuccessfully for the Democratic nomination for governor. Jimmy Carter made a second run for governor in 1970 and won. Carter as such continued to support the civil rights movement and appointed many African Americans to important posts. With almost no name recognition, Jimmy Carter decided to run for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1976. He became popular among younger voters and the national media. He won the nomination and chose Walter Mondale as his running mate. In the end, it was a narrow win for the Democrats and Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter faced recession and high inflation at the beginning of his presidency. Carter's perhaps darkest chapter within his presidency was when in 1979, Iranian militias seized the U.S. Embassy and held 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. The hostage-taking was held on for 444 days until after Carter left office and is known as the Iran hostage crisis. Further, Jimmy Carter was confronted with the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union and the energy crisis within the US. He ran for re-election in 1980. However, he stood no chance against Republican Ronald Reagan. Carter lost by a margin of 489 to 49 in the Electoral College. Jimmy Carter left office in 1981 and returned to Plains where he continued to run his peanut business. In addition, he began writing books and lecturing at Emory University. In 1982, he founded the Carter Center, which aimed at promoting human rights and fighting disease worldwide. Together with his wife, Jimmy Carter became active in Habitat for Humanity, which is an organization dedicated to building affordable housing around the world. You can find pictures of Jimmy Carter himself working on building houses, even up until old age. For his efforts, Jimmy Carter received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. He is as such one of only 3 presidents who have won that very prize. In his 90s, Carter was confronted with brain and liver cancer, which was successfully treated. He suffered a series of falls, which resulted in a broken hip, a pelvic fracture, and a black eye. In February 2023, the Carter Center announced that Jimmy Carter decided to receive hospice care. On October 1, 2024, Jimmy Carter became the first president to reach the age of 100. Carter himself stated that he never expected to live that long and that his best explanation for his longevity was a good marriage. Jimmy Carter also holds the title of longest retired president and the first president to live to the 40th anniversary of his inauguration. And lastly, Jimmy Carter also holds the title of longest-lived president of the United States. He passed away on December 29, 2024 at 100 years and 89 days. His state funeral is set to take place in January 2025.